Greetings and good afternoon to one and all. I'm Himla Sudial, the Executive Officer at the Academy of Science of South Africa. I'm trying to change my background, but in any event, I'm still going to advertise for ASAP hosting of the Science 20. So I apologize that background is on at the moment. Nonetheless, it is such an ideal opportunity for us to host this webinar jointly with the Royal Academy of the Netherlands. And in fact, we've had the pleasure of engaging with the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts, Science and Sciences for some time now. And in 2023, there was a delegation that came to South Africa, and we had some very productive engagements, which has sort of resulted in us now having opportunities to engage a little bit better together. So hopefully this is the start of many to come in the future. So welcome to colleagues from the Netherlands and South Africa, and from wherever else you may be joining us. It is indeed a great honor and privilege for us to have such an occasion, and in particular to focus on the theme of reforming research assessment, perspectives from the global north and south. So I will try to be a good program director and steer us through the next couple of hours. But before I get ahead of myself, I think it's an ideal opportunity for me to invite the Vice President of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, Professor Brenda Penix, to address us first. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Himla. It's also a very nice honor for me to welcome all of you to this joint webinar. I'm indeed the Vice President since 3 years of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I'm also professor at the VU University in Amsterdam, working in the medical field. And I think really we are very excited to co-host this joint webinar on reforming research assessment and publishing practices together with the Academy of Science South Africa, where we hope to gain perspectives from both the global north and south. And as you already indicated, it is exactly 2 years ago that the Royal Netherlands Academy visited South Africa during a mission together with the Dutch Ministry of Science and Knowledge Institutes. And we also had a nice delegation from our Royal Academy, with both the presidents of our Royal Academy of Science and Arts being present, but also the president of our Young Academy. And I know that this was really a great chance to meet with the African Academy of Sciences and also the South African Young Academy of Sciences. And during that meeting in Pretoria, there was an exchange between the two academies, and there were a lot of discussions on similarities and particularities. And also the wish was expressed to collaborate on topics of mutual interest. And at that time, we identified many topics for collaboration, also ones where we could actively involve our members in, by providing a platform for exchange on science policy themes. And I think really soon it was really clear that the future of publishing practices and research assessments is really a theme that is a very timely theme. I think this really gets a lot of attention these days in the Netherlands. And I think it's really a theme where we can incorporate and should incorporate both perspectives from the global north, but also the south, and really learn from each other. So throughout the last 2 years, I know that there have been close contacts between the academies, and there have been lots of discussions on the right format and working on the program that we will have today with keynotes and plenty of room for discussion. So we really hope that this webinar will provide some valuable material for discussion, and that it will serve as a lasting collaboration between our academies and the academic communities in our countries. So I think the key objectives for this webinar are to really learn from perspectives on research assessments and also publishing policies such as open science policies from the global north and south, evaluate the status quo of research assessment and explore recent propositions for reform as highlighted in key reports that we will also be hearing about today. And obviously discuss the rapidly emerging changes in efforts to reform individual research assessments, but also university rankings, journal evaluation, funding allocation, and institutional assessments. So I really hope we will have a lively discussion that will lead to some actionable next steps. And I really wish you a very nice webinar. Thank you. And I give the word back to the next presenter.
Shall I just introduce myself, Brenda? Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, shall I just introduce myself or?
Yes, I think so,
Okay.
because I think Himla, the one who was opening, I think she's frozen. So
Hi.
maybe,
Good afternoon. I think Professor Yale's been frozen out, so
yes.
I would appreciate it if the next speaker can introduce herself and go ahead. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. No, I will do. Thank you. Just wasn't sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Karen Strubans. I am one of the vice chairs of the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. Not to worry in case you haven't heard of that organization, because I will say a lot more about it, but let me just first see that I can share the slides and put them in speaking mode. Is that coming up all right for everyone?
Yes, it looks good.
Perfect. Good. So I was asked to say a bit more as one of the vice chairs of COARA about global trends and innovations in research evaluation. And as was already introduced, I just wanted to, of course, start from the fact that indeed this reform movement is really a global one. There's actually a lot of organizations and within them a lot of individuals who are recognizing, I think increasingly, that there is a need to reform the existing ways of how we assess research, partly to address problems that we now have real evidence for with relying predominantly on journal and publication-based metrics, which happens in a lot of assessment approaches across the world. Because this can be a hurdle to the recognition of more diverse contributions, but it might also negatively affect the quality and impact of research. And we also know there are unhealthy effects on the environments that researchers work in, and then by extension to the health and well-being of researchers. And as I said, this is an initiative that has gained momentum across the globe. It probably all really started with the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment almost a decade ago now. But there's been really a lot of different initiatives since. So there's been the Leiden Manifesto that I think Ludo will talk a bit more about after my talk, but there's been lots of other groupings. iNorms is a group of research management societies that also has a research evaluation group that has been very active, and I'll talk a bit more about some of their work later. There also were the Hong Kong principles in 2019. There's a Latin American Forum on Research Assessment and also a Global Research Council working group. So that's bringing together funding organizations from across the world. The organization that I am speaking on behalf is the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment that was launched in 2022. It started in Europe, but really has ambitions to engage members and organizations globally. And again, I'll talk a bit about how far we've come with that so far. And then more recently, I've also been invited to be involved in an International Science Council forum on publishing and research assessment that wants to bring kind of more the bridge between reforms in publishing and research assessment. And there is also a scoping phase going on of an OECD Global Science Forum activity on research assessment and incentives. So as Brenda already introduced, there's more and more focus on the need for this reform and also really very concrete ways in which people are taking this forward. So then I'll say a bit more about the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment itself. So the coalition really centers around the agreement on reforming research assessment. And this is an agreement that I was the pen holder for, but surrounded by a team of people and also with inputs from over 350 organizations, mainly in Europe, because that's where the initiative started, but also from beyond there. Sorry, I can hear someone's not on mute. Can participants please mute so we don't get the background? Thank you. Perfect. And so the agreement's purpose was really to set a shared direction for change in assessment practice at different levels. So for research, but also for researchers and research performing organizations. And its overarching goal, and we'll come, I hope, a bit more in the discussion on what the goals are of assessment reform, was ultimately to maximize the quality and impact of research through the changes that we'll see implemented. So what does this agreement say? The focus or the kind of center of it are really the 4 core commitments. And I will talk a bit later about trends and innovations against each of these. So it will be helpful framing also for that part of my presentation today. So the 4 commitments are, I'm sorry, there's someone again. Yeah, thank you. The 4 commitments, the first one is on recognizing the diversity of contributions, not only to research, but also in terms of careers, in accordance with the needs and the nature of the research, because we know there's differences there. The second, to base research assessment primarily on qualitative evaluation, for which peer review is central, but supported by responsible use of quantitative indicators as appropriate. The third one, to abandon the inappropriate uses in research assessment of journal and publication-based metrics. And I would say this is the commitment that most closely aligns with the initial intentions of the declaration that Dora posed to researchers. And then the last one is a commitment to avoid the use of rankings of research organizations in research assessment. These core commitments are supported by 6 additional commitments, 3 that really focus on enabling the reform. So they're more around committing resources, raising awareness, and the actual process of developing new tools, criteria, and processes. And 3 commitments that are more focused on the exchange, the communication, and also ensuring that the progress we make is evidence informed. So in terms of the coalition's membership, since COARA was launched in 2022, we have had 888 people sign the agreement, and of those, 773 have joined the coalition. As you can see from the graph, the kind of majority of these are really universities, but there's also other types of organizations, research centers, academies, learned societies, also national regional authorities, public and private research funding organizations, and some other non-profit organizations that are involved in research assessment. And maybe more importantly for this audience, COARA from the beginning has had a goal, although it really started and nucleated, let's say, in Europe to involve a more global membership. As you can see from the kind of map of our membership, there is still a lot more members in Europe, but we are starting to engage members on all continents. And we have today members in about 30% of the world's countries, although we realize there's quite a lot more work to do because a lot of those include 1 or 2 members in a long tail that you see here on the graph. But still, we're really happy that there is already that engagement beyond Europe that was in the initial intentions. Of course, as important as who is involved is what are we doing. So I did want to say something about COARA's main mechanisms for action before talking a bit more about the trends and innovations that we're starting to see. And the main elements that enable COARA to undertake action are the first one are its action plans. I think these are incredibly important. Those organizations who sign the agreement and who join COARA, they not only commit to the core and supplementary commitments, but they also commit that they will share an action plan on how they're going to achieve these commitments within the first year of signing the agreements. And then in the fifth year of signing the agreements, they also commit to do a self-reflection piece that they publicly share to show how they've made progress on their action plan. I think this is an important cornerstone of the coalition. And it is a difference with DORA that we are asking people to really follow up on their commitments and share publicly how they are doing that. And so this just shows the logos of some of the organizations that have already submitted action plans. There's a lot more work to do. A lot of members who signed more than a year ago have yet to submit their plans. So we're actively doing efforts to support them in arriving there and sharing examples and good practice from those who have already done it. A second mechanism for COARA are its working groups. We have a range of working groups working on a topical level. These are really based on voluntary input from our members. They're very bottom up, and many of them are actually finishing soon and will be producing outputs that then go through an endorsement process by the coalition. Just to kind of show that, maybe point out a few of the working groups that might be of interest to this audience. So we have a working group on responsible metrics and indicators. We have one that is looking at a global framework, so also involving members from outside Europe on research evaluations, social science and humanities. We also have one on multilingualism that I think is a really interesting one, and on inclusive evaluation and of research. And we encourage across all of these working groups to be as inclusive as possible and to really do active efforts to engage members across the breadth of European countries and beyond that as much as possible. In addition to our working groups, we also have a mechanism through national chapters. These weren't seen as a very important part of COARA in its inception, but they've actually shown to be central for a coherent COARA approach. And I will talk a bit later about how national chapters are already inspiring each other in their work. As you can see from the slide, we have gained quite a few new national chapters since 2023, when the first few were launched. This is still very European focused. There was conversations going on a Latin American chapter, but I would have to check with colleagues on where we are and the status of that. But we are really encouraging the formation of regional chapters beyond Europe. It would be nice to include more of those in the future. And then finally, COARA also distributes cascade funding to drive institutional transformation. A big caveat on that is that at the moment, the funding for this is coming from the European Commission. And so we are restricted with the eligibility rules, the same ones that count for those programs. So we have started our own fundraising campaign to be able to be more inclusive in this cascade funding. So far, we've had 2 calls. They're really focused on enhancing institutional change. So they have funded 25 projects in total, very much focused on either institutional pilots, institutional change projects, or teaming projects where there's really kind of close learning from each other between organizations. So that should be enough to understand what COARA is and what we do. We are also starting to try and understand more of the impact of COARA, and in the kind of spirit of this, I want to talk a bit about trends and innovations in research assessment, but I do want to caveat that many of these trends and innovations I'll be talking about have started before the launch of COARA, but we know that many of them have been exchanged on or promoted through COARA and its mechanisms. And many of them also link to the core commitments of COARA, and that's the way I would like to present them. So the first commitment, if you remember, was around recognizing broader contributions. And there have been really interesting innovations in relation to narrative curriculum vitae and portfolios that really envision enabling this broader recognition of contributions beyond counting publications. On the slide, you see examples of the NIH BioSketch that has existed for quite some time, that does give this opportunity for narrative explanation of people's career path. And the Royal Society Narrative CV on the left that has a similar aim and was introduced by several European funders more recently. There also have been efforts, for example, by the peer exchange platform that is hosted by the Marie Curie Alumni Association to encourage and support researchers with adapting to these new formats. I'm actually currently working on a review of whether these formats are achieving their goals, and it is clear that there are no silver bullets, and a lot of other measures need to really go in the same people-oriented direction to make this work. And also the guidance and the support for reviewers is essential in achieving with these formats the broader recognition that is envisioned. We see similar portfolio approaches in the form of national initiatives. So examples here, one is actually from the Netherlands, has its Room for Everyone's Talent national program that also envisages a portfolio approach that balances better research, teaching, leadership, and impact. So again, broadening what is valued and recognized. A very interesting example is also the Norway Career Assessment Matrix. This is one of the examples where through our national chapters and actually interactions between our national chapters, we actually see that this model is being taken on by other countries, Finland, Sweden, but I know also Poland, for example, had an interest. So there our national chapters are really aiding cross-pollination of these national initiatives between countries. Again, a lot of focus within Europe at the moment, but we hope that we can also spread these initiatives beyond that. And then there's not only these national initiatives, there's also these portfolio approaches are also starting to be trialed in an institutional context. And one example is the merit portal that is used for appointments at Charité in Berlin in Germany. Then in relation to the second commitment, which really wants to set quality expert judgment at the center of assessment, we know that there is a lot of attention at the moment for improving peer review and really supporting that with evidence. On the slide, I'm showing a recent review of peer review from UK Research Innovation, the main funder in the UK. And this looks, for example, at the use of double-blind processes, diversity in panels, and a range of other measures that could help improve peer review. Rory, also the Research on Research Institute in the UK, recently published a report on distributed peer review as an alternative. We, of course, know that there's also a lot of innovation in action at the level of publishing platforms and publishers in relation to open peer review, post-publication feedback, review preprints, and so on. And through COARA, there's definitely also a view that peer review itself is increasingly recognized as a very valued approach in career assessment, but with caveats that it is also imperfect and it also needs to evolve as we also get more of this evidence from these studies on how it can be further improved. The third commitment of our core commitments relates to the responsible use of metrics. And as I said also in the introduction, this is really the commitment that relates or links back the most to DORA and the initial principles that DORA has been built on. So I did want to first of all refer back to the DORA guidance on responsible use of quantitative indicators in research assessment. There's also been increasing dialogue between COARA and bibliometrics communities about the positioning of metrics within the assessment reform movement, and perhaps Ludo will also say a bit more about that. I did also want to point out again that COARA has a responsible metrics and indicators working group. We have to still yet see what the outcomes of that group will be, but we should soon get outputs for endorsement by the coalition. So that is an exciting space to watch. And one important change that we wanted to highlight in the European context is that the European Research Council has taken a stance on banning references to publications journal impact factor, a move that definitely was inspired by DORA and at the time also COARA that was in its infancy when this change happened. Sorry, I'm going to just ask, there's again someone who is not muted, who we can hear in the background. Thank you. And finally, the fourth core commitment of COARA tackles moving beyond rankings. When we were drafting the agreement, this was definitely the agreement, the core commitment that there was most tension around. And it's perhaps important to kind of reiterate why it matters. So commercial rankings are an immensely big driver at the moment of university strategies and ultimately really influence the behavior of researchers on the ground. At the same time, the data they use are often opaque. The indicators are often flawed. It's often a black box. We don't really know what's going on. So it doesn't seem to be the most reliable kind of basis for our decisions. Universities have started to take a stand against this. So already in 2022, Yale and Harvard Law School withdrew from the influential US News and World Report rankings. More recently, Utrecht University, University of Zurich, and Sorbonne University have also announced withdrawals from the Times Higher Education rankings, and they are no longer submitting their data to these rankings. At the same time, in terms of innovations, we see real alternatives emerging to this. Ludo might say a bit more about the CWTS open learning rankings. That is one alternative, but also iNorms, research evaluation group, has launched a few years ago the More Than Our Rank initiative. And I do want to say this is an initiative that doesn't only try to help us move beyond rankings, but it also ticks off the other COARA core commitments. It really focuses the description of universities' contributions much more on a qualitative description, and it also allows to focus on a much broader range of things than are generally included in university rankings. So I hope that gives a flavor of some of the innovations and trends that we are seeing in relation, especially to those 4 priorities for COARA. Looking ahead, the first thing to say is please stay tuned. Our COARA working groups a lot of them are kind of finishing their work in the next few months. There will be lots of outputs, new kind of guides and practical tools that will be up for endorsement and then adoption. So watch that space, because those will be shared publicly also for those who are not yet a member of the coalition. We also can really feel that there is this cross-pollination between national initiatives, inspiring countries across borders. So we're also really watching this phase and see how that evolves. And then, of course, ultimately, the whole goal of COARA is to go from current assessment to an assessment that maximizes quality and impact of research and supports a more healthy research culture. And from our side, we're also starting to ask questions around whether we're achieving these goals. So we're starting to look at evaluating COARA as an initiative, and if we can include it, it's probably partly resource dependent. Also, the contribution to that broader research assessment movement and how that is resulting in outcomes and impacts. So again, a space to watch in the coming months. And I think I will end there. Of course, I think these slides will be shared with you, so you'll have access to all the links on here. Please do consider joining as an organization, and please engage with us as an individuals. There's plenty of ways to do so, and they're all pointed out here. So do explore the links once the slides are shared. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention and take any immediate questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Strobens, and apologies again when my computer crashed and I couldn't introduce you properly. For fear of it happening again, I'm not going to turn on my camera, so I apologize for that as well. Colleagues, please use the chat box to post any questions that you may have, and we will field those during the discussion session. It was really a remarkable update of what the COARA is doing, and I'm sure many people from the local context may have questions. So please feel free to post questions in the chat box, and my colleagues will feel through that as we go ahead. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Ludo Waltman to address us. And she is the Scientific Director in Quantitative Science Studies at the University of Leiden. And she's going to give us a keynote address on the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics, a pivotal guide for research evaluation, the Center for Science and Technology Studies. Over to you, Professor Waltman.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I will share my screen. So I hope you're now able to see my slides. What I would like to do, I would like to share with you some experiences from the city of Leiden in the Netherlands and my university, Leiden University. The topic of today's meeting, research assessment reform, also reform in kind of related areas like scientific publishing, open science. That topic is for us a topic that we are very much engaged with. We do a lot of work in that area. It's sometimes also a struggle for us. So we definitely don't have all the answers. We sometimes really kind of have difficult, complex conversations also within this university on these topics. We sometimes disagree. We sometimes have small fights in the university on how to move forward. And I would like to share with you some of the things that I've learned myself about research assessment reform based on the work that we are doing here in Leiden. So I will show you some things that we contributed to the broader international debates, the debates in the Netherlands, but I will also give you a little bit of insight into things that are happening internally within this university. And before I go into more detail, I should probably start by actually giving you a little bit of a background story on the university. So what you see here is at the left the academy building of Leiden University in the city center of Leiden. Leiden is a town with a great history, and also the university has a very nice history. We are celebrating the 450th anniversary of the university, this university is actually the oldest university in the Netherlands. It's a university that is multidisciplinary, basically covering all disciplines. And Leiden is a city that really kind of flourishes around the university. The university is really, to a large degree, kind of shaping the identity of the city. So that is my university. Within this university, I have a particular role that I would like to briefly mention. I have a role that is called Ambassador for Open Science. So I am responsible for promoting open science within this university. So some of the insights I will share are insights that relate to that particular role I have. My role related to promoting open science. And in many cases, that also means promoting open science in the context of questions about how do we do assessment? How do we evaluate academics at this university? And how do we, for instance, also think about the career system at this university? So that's one part of what I would like to share with you. What you see at the right is the center that I'm director of. I'm director of the Center for Science and Technology Studies, which is sometimes abbreviated as CWTS, the Centrum voor Wetenschaps- en Technologiestudies in Dutch. So you see our building. We are part of the university, one of the 25 institutes of Leiden University. My center, CWTS, we are a research center that is studying the research system. So we have a team of academics, of scholars, that study systematically how the research system is functioning, the dynamics in the research system, the challenges the system is facing. What we also do is we use all the knowledge that we produce, we use that knowledge to actually try to contribute to strengthening the research system, to improving it, to also trying to help solve certain problems the system is facing. And we always try to do that in an evidence-informed way. So the evidence is what we get from the research that we do, and then we want to mobilize that evidence to contribute to well, hopefully to solutions. So in that sense, we are also very close to all kinds of policy debates in the research system. For instance, policy debates about how research assessment can best be done, policy debates about open science, about scientific publishing, and a number of other key issues. We also have some connections to South Africa, which I would like to briefly highlight. In particular, I would like to mention our intensive collaboration with the Center for Research on Evaluation Science and Technology, CREST. This is a long-standing partnership that we have where CWTS staff, so staff in my center, and CREST staff are working together in a diverse range of projects. And this has been for my center a really enriching experience. We learned a lot about the research system in South Africa and in Africa more in general. We also have some collaborations with the National Research Foundation in South Africa, and these collaborations we have through the Research on Research Institute, RORI, that was already briefly mentioned by Karen. This work that we do is actually part of our UNESCO Chair on Diversity and Inclusion in Global Science. So that's where we are investing a lot of effort in making connections with countries globally, and South Africa is actually one important country in that whole constellation. We are investing a lot in these connections to develop a rich understanding of basically the way in which research systems in different countries are organized, also assessment systems, and trying to use that knowledge to make sure that whatever we do in Leiden, in my center, whatever we do in terms of trying to understand the research system, but also intervening in the system and trying to contribute to addressing some of the challenges the system is doing. In all these cases, we feel it is important that we do so from an understanding of the system at the global level, and not just from the way we, for instance, have the system as it is organized in, for instance, the Netherlands or in the European Union. Okay, so that's a little bit about my background and the center that I am director of. I now would like to briefly say something about a particular intervention that we made 1 decade ago. So 10 years ago, in 2015, the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics was published. I'm one of the co-authors of that manifesto. The other authors are Paul Wouters, Diana Hicks, Sarah de Rijke, and Ismail Rafels. So I had the privilege to work with these colleagues. Some of them actually colleagues here in Leiden, but also, for instance, Diana Hicks being based in the US. I had the pleasure to work with them and to jointly think about a statement about some of the pressing challenges that at that time, 10 years ago, we were facing around the use of research metrics in the research system, and in particular also for the purpose of research evaluation. I would actually argue that many of these challenges we are still facing. There has been well, lots of things have happened over the past decade. Things have improved, certain things. We also have new challenges that we are facing nowadays. But I feel that many of the kind of the points we made in this manifesto 10 years ago, they still have a lot of relevance today. And that's also why I would like to go a bit deeper in kind of the content of this manifesto. So what actually is this manifesto about? Why did we actually publish that manifesto? And how does it relate to all kinds of developments that are now going on? And what is the practical relevance of all of this for basically research organizations globally? Yeah, this manifesto, this Leiden manifesto, it is the result of a conference that took place in Leiden. So here in the city of Leiden, a conference was organized by my center in 2014. And in that conference, there was a panel debate. And in that panel debate, a kind of consensus emerged on the idea that the research system was suffering from an over-reliance on quantitative indicators and metrics, in particular in the context of research evaluation. So panelists were deeply concerned about this over-reliance on metrics. Interestingly, actually, the conference was organized by a community that is itself very deeply involved in developing these indicators and these metrics. For instance, my own center, but also colleagues globally. It's a community of academics that have put a lot of effort in developing research indicators. Sometimes these are called bibliometric indicators or scientometric indicators. We feel these indicators have a lot of value, can provide a lot of valuable information. But we also felt 10 years ago that, in a sense, the research system had become addicted to these metrics. There was over-reliance on these metrics. All kinds of decisions were made based on these metrics, and in many cases even based exclusively on these metrics. And this, we felt, is not responsible. This is actually not the way in which, from the viewpoint of this community, people like myself and many other experts, this is not the way in which we felt these metrics, these indicators, are supposed to be used. Because we always felt that quantitative indicators, data-driven metrics, can play an extremely important role in supporting decision-making, supporting research assessment, but their role should indeed be a role in support of decision-making by human experts. And the metrics should not overtake the role of these human experts. So in the Leiden Manifesto, there are 10 principles that we introduced. You can see them here. This is actually a screenshot that I took from a small video that we produced. You can find it on the website, leidenmanifesto.org. And in this video, we explain these 10 principles. The Leiden Manifesto became quite influential. So these 10 principles, they have been taken up in all kinds of ways by evaluators, by academics, by policymakers globally. And I will show you in a minute a number of examples of initiatives that have developed and that to a certain degree build also on ideas from the Leiden Manifesto. You will see actually some overlap with some of the initiatives that Karen already introduced. So the Leiden Manifesto was one particular intervention, not the only one. There were many more. For instance, the Dora Declaration that Karen also mentioned. But the Leiden Manifesto was one particular intervention that I believe has contributed to shaping the debate about what is a responsible way to do research assessment, what is a responsible way to also make use of scientometric indicators. Okay. Karen introduced the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, which is one of the most influential initiatives at the moment around research assessment reform. And actually, in the Leiden Manifesto, one of these 10 principles is the principle to use quantitative evaluation to support expert evaluation. So this is exactly what 10 years ago we felt was going wrong. Quantitative evaluation too often was not used to support expert evaluation, but essentially to replace expert evaluation. So we made that argument that yes, there is value in quantitative indicators, quantitative metrics, analytics, but they should be used in a supportive role. And this, as Karen also explained, is actually now one of the key commitments, one of the core commitments in the COARA agreement. It's the second commitment, based research assessment primarily on qualitative evaluation. So here you see the connection between the Leiden Manifesto, the debate that the manifesto tried to push, and what is now being embraced more and more by research organizations globally, in particular organizations that have signed the COARA agreement. This also shows how the debate has progressed over the past decade, how we have moved from an intervention like the Leiden Manifesto to actual concrete steps being taken by lots of research organizations that are now making commitments, that are making action plans, and that are thinking about how to actually implement and fulfill these commitments. Another principle that we introduced in the Leiden Manifesto is to measure performance, research performance, in accordance with the mission of an organization. So too often what you see is that we evaluate research in a particular way because we feel that that's just the way it is supposed to be done. So for instance, we feel that articles in peer-reviewed journals is the best way to share scientific results, to also show the value of scientific results, perhaps the impact of scientific results. And therefore, when we evaluate research, this is the thing we look at. We look at the articles in the peer-reviewed journals. And that's kind of more or less the only thing that we really consider. The argument made in the Leiden Manifesto is that when we measure performance, research performance, the way we should do that always needs to be context sensitive. It should depend on the mission of a particular organization or a particular research unit, or it should depend on the strategic goals of an organization. What we see now is that this principle is more and more being adopted. In the Netherlands, for instance, we have the strategy evaluation protocol. It's a protocol for evaluating research units within universities. And this protocol, as the name already states, it always starts from the strategy of the research unit. So when we evaluate a research unit, the strategy is leading. And that means that the evaluation for one unit could be quite different from the evaluation for some other unit. So a unit that has a strategy that is, for instance, focused on realizing societal impact could be quite different from an evaluation for a research unit whose strategy is focused very much on doing fundamental breakthrough research without necessarily being focused on immediate scientific relevance, societal relevance. So this context dependence is critical, and that's what we basically mean with doing the evaluation in line with the mission, with the strategic goals. Also, the scope framework is something I really want to mention. It's something that that was developed by colleagues in the INORMS Research Evaluation Group, and they made a framework that I feel is really powerful, and that is based on similar ideas. Another principle in the Leiden Manifesto is to protect excellence in locally relevant research. So what we also 10 years ago were very much concerned about, and the concern still stands, is an exclusive focus on research that is published in international journals in English, that is addressing problems that might be very important and very relevant for some of us, but not for all of us. And also, this is a dynamic, of course, that might lead to certain other problems being overlooked and not being given the attention that they deserve. So in particular, problems that kind of have a certain local relevance, for instance, health problems that kind of are of relevance mostly in particular parts of the world, or that are address mostly particular parts of the global population, these types of problems might not get the attention they deserve if research evaluation is focused almost exclusively on publishing in English language scientific journals that are operated by journal editors based in a limited number of countries, typically global north countries. This is not the way research evaluation should be done. We need to also recognize the importance of locally relevant research that perhaps is disseminated not in English but in different ways. So here, for instance, I want to mention the Helsinki initiative on multilingualism, which is one particular initiative that is promoting this type of diversity in research assessment. Another principle in the Leiden Manifesto is to keep data collection and analytical processes open, transparent, and simple. So what we saw 10 years ago is that often the indicators that we use, they are black boxes. They are based on data from proprietary databases, for instance, databases like Web of Science and Scopus. And these databases impose all kinds of limitations on how the data can be used. And that means that any indicator, any metric that you produce based on that data becomes a kind of a black box. You cannot really see what is behind the numbers. And that means that actually we're going to make decisions based on analytics, on indicators that we don't fully understand. And that's very risky. So in the LIDAR manifesto, the point was made that data collection and analytical processes should be open and transparent. So yes, it is perfectly fine to rely partly on quantitative data-driven indicators, but make sure that data collection is done in an open and transparent way. And also all the calculations of indicators are done in a transparent manner. Recently, an initiative was launched, partly also by my center here in Leiden, but we did it together with colleagues in Europe. We launched the Barcelona Declaration on Open Research Information, and this is a systematic effort to push a global transition towards what we call open research information. And one reason why we do that is because we feel that openness of research information, and research information that means, for instance, information about the outputs that researchers produce, information also about all kinds of activities that researchers undertake. Openness of that information is crucial to fulfill this specific principle in the LIDAR manifesto and to make research assessment more responsible. We have now more and more research organizations globally that have signed this Barcelona Declaration and that are moving away from, for instance, proprietary bibliometric data sources, for instance, sources like Web of Science or Scopus, and there's a movement towards open alternatives for these data sources. And then, of course, also when you produce analytics and indicators, you can do this in much more transparent ways. Then there was also the principle in the LIDAR manifesto to assess individual researchers using qualitative judgments of their portfolios. And this is also closely related to what Karen already mentioned. The movement towards thinking about how CVs should actually be constructed in ways that kind of promote responsible research assessment practices. So there's a lot of discussion that is now ongoing around narrative CVs. Sometimes it's called evidence-based CVs. That's the language we use in the Netherlands. So at my center, we also contributed to these discussions. We, for instance, published this piece where we introduced 10 ways to improve academic CVs. So I want to highlight that this is really an important development that deserves our attention. And then finally, the LIDAR manifesto also states that we need to recognize the systemic effects of assessments and indicators. So if at a particular place in the research system, we make a decision to choose to use a particular indicator to support decision-making, to support research assessment, that actually might have all kinds of implications also elsewhere in the system, because there are dependencies. For instance, universities that participate in university rankings and that actually feel they need to do better in these rankings, they might create incentives internally to actually push their own staff members, their research staff, to actually change the way they do their research to make it more focused on the specific indicators that the rankings, the university rankings, are using. So we see that incentives introduced in one part of the system might create all kinds of incentives in other parts of the system. And these incentives are not necessarily the incentives that we believe promote responsible approach to research assessment. And university rankings are one example of that dynamic. So in the Netherlands, we published this report, Ranking the University. It is a report in which we have developed a strategy for culture change around university rankings in the Netherlands. So the Dutch universities are now working on implementing the roadmap that was introduced in this report. And again, this relates to one of the principles in the LIDAR manifesto. Okay. So this shows some of the things that have happened over the past 10 years, with the LIDAR manifesto being one of the early steps in a much bigger and much broader international, global movement towards making research assessment more responsible. Going back now to my own university, I would like to briefly say something about our own journey. Because yes, we published that manifesto, and we have lots of ideas about how things can be done in better ways. But at the same time, also my own university is sometimes struggling to actually kind of change the way we do things. And what we have at Leiden University is a program that is called Academia in Motion. And in this program, we are working on embracing open science, building an open knowledge community, and also changing the way we organize the recognition and rewards mechanisms for our staff members. There's lots of things happening in this Academia in Motion program. It's about culture change within the university. Culture change, as we all know, is not always easy. I won't go into the details of all the things that are ongoing. It's a lot. There's lots of things ongoing. This is actually one of the priorities now for the university to realize this culture change. I just want to briefly kind of say a few things about what this is about. What are the key commitments that we have made internally within Leiden University? So one is promoting a culture of openness and transparency. That, for instance, means that staff members are entitled to have transparency with respect to career opportunities that the university might be able to offer or might not be able to offer. So transparency can, of course, go in both directions. Sometimes certain things are not possible, and then the university also needs to be transparent about this. Transparency also means, for instance, that whenever we use quantitative indicators, we want to do that based on open data. We want to do that in transparent ways. These indicators should be fully transparent, reproducible, and all of that. Strengthen the quality of our academic work. So this means that we need broader, more inclusive ideas about what quality actually means and how quality can be assessed. So that means moving away from the idea that quality is publishing in high impact scientific journals. We still care about publishing articles that are influential, articles that are widely read. We still value that a lot. But we also value many other things: engagement with society, citizen science, working with policymakers, connecting the research that we do to the teaching that we do. All these things are extremely important, and we are working towards giving more recognition to these types of things, instead of having this narrow focus on only the articles that we publish, perhaps also the funding that we acquire. Valuing societal engagement and relevance, I already mentioned that. Citizen science, working with policymakers, working with all kinds of societal stakeholders. This is something that is now much more getting priority in the way we think about how to recognize and reward academics within our university. Setting strategic team goals. So that also goes back to the Leiden Manifesto. We need to think about, whenever we give recognition and we reward academics for the work they do, we should do it in a way that is aligned with the broader goals of our organization, the goals of the individual teams, the individual research units in the university. So this is a different way of thinking. This also means that we all need to be much more sensitive to the idea that we work in teams. We don't operate as individuals that each kind of have their own agendas. Most of the things we do them together in teams, and these teams have goals. And what matters is how each of us is contributing to the bigger goals of our teams. And then finally, we have investment in leadership skills, which is also a big thing at our university. Leadership skills that we consider to be essential, both personal leadership, but also organizational leadership. It's a big thing that we are highlighting. This is something that's quite essential to realize the culture shift that we are striving for. I'm going to give you one very practical example, and then I will more or less conclude. One very practical example of what, in practice, all of this means. PhD students, we have lots of them at this university, and they do extremely important work, but actually it's a little bit unclear what we expect from them. So there is all kinds of implicit norms on what a PhD student is supposed to do. For instance, many professors at this university, they talk to each other and say, yeah, my PhD students, I guess I expect them to publish about 4 articles, and then they can get their PhD degree. There's no formal document that actually states this kind of rule, But implicitly, this is how we, until recently, how we thought about what a PhD thesis should be. 4 articles published in reputable scientific peer-reviewed journals. At the medical faculty, the Leiden University Medical Centers, we have now completely, we've gone through a process of completely redesigning what a PhD thesis should actually entail. And we have recognized, for instance, that PhD work is typically, to a large degree, team science. You work as a member of a team. And of course, you need to also prove your individual abilities. But these individual abilities, to a significant degree, are about contributing to teams. And in the way we think about PhD thesis and the way in which we think about awarding PhD degrees, we need to consider that. We need to consider that the research we do is team science, and that what we need to value is the way in which individuals contribute to teams. What we also need to value much more is open science, the adoption of open science practices in PhD work. So for instance, now at the LUMC, there's no longer the expectation that all the articles that researchers write are published in peer-reviewed journals. A PhD candidate is supposed to publish 1 article in a peer-reviewed journal or some other peer-reviewed venue. All the other articles or all the other chapters of the thesis, they need to be made publicly available somehow, but not necessarily in a journal. For instance, preprint servers and other types of repositories could play a much more prominent role now compared to the way we did this in the past. So that's a big shift in the way we are thinking about how to share and how to disseminate the knowledge that we produce, and in particular the knowledge that the PhD candidates produce. There's much more that can be said about this framework, but this is some of the highlights of the way in which we are rethinking and reforming the way we do PhD education at the university. I guess I want to stop here. There's a lot more that can be said, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm of course happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Waltman. I mean, it was so revealing, and I'm sure there will be questions about the practical nature of implementing some of the procedures that you follow in the Netherlands and Leiden elsewhere. For example, at the Academy of Science of South Africa, during our new nominations processes, we look at academic excellence as well as contribution to society and leadership. But inevitably, the impact factors, etc., come into that dialogue. So it will be interesting when we have the discussion session to see how you could add some value to those sorts of thinking. But I don't want to get ahead of myself and hog the session, because we do have a discussion session. And colleagues, please use the opportunity to have questions for the experts that we have on the panel and in the keynote. But use the chat box for now so that you could go ahead and log your question, and somebody would go through it and assist in the discussion. But it's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague from the Secretariat, Ms. Susan Felsman, who oversees our scholarly publishing unit at the Academy. And Susan will direct proceedings during the next session. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much, Himla, and good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much to our previous 2 speakers. Absolutely fascinating to hear how these things are actually unfolding elsewhere. But I would like to sort of turn a little bit now towards South Africa and invite my other colleagues, perhaps sort of a 10-minute slot, 5 to 10-minute slot in where they respond. We specifically selected these speakers because of their interest and because of the work they have been doing in South Africa for over a long time. Professor Sue McKenna, she's from the University of Rhodes. This is really her field of interest. We know she does some great work in terms of research reform assessments, etc., and she advocates for quite a number of things as well as an institution, etc. Sue, I really would like you to also focus perhaps on the stance that the University of Rhodes has taken, that they will not be ranked, and they do not subscribe to the ranking system, the university ranking systems. And why did you do that? And what is the effect, and what is the reaction of the sector as such? After that, we will move to Professor Daya Reddy. Professor Reddy was not only the president of the Academy a couple of years ago, but doing quite significant work internationally on the research in its entirety, but is known for his leadership in terms of in higher education institutions in South Africa as well. For him, I will ask to please focus a bit on what he found in the sector, and what effect does it have, and where does he see all of this actually going. And then, of course, lastly but not least, is Dr. Yenzi Flores, who is, we thought we'll bring in also a young voice. She is also the vice, I think it's vice chair, Yenzi, of the Young Academy of Sciences. But we will certainly hear what's being done there. After the three speakers, I will invite both Ludo and Karen, perhaps just for some very quick comments, etc. And then we will move over then to question and answer sessions. For that, we will have half an hour now to introduce or for our other three speakers, so that we can also hear their voice. And then we'll allocate another half an hour then for discussions and questions, etc. So thank you very much, colleagues, for agreeing to join us this afternoon. We really appreciate your availability. Professor McKenna, can I hand over to you, perhaps to give your remarks in terms of the subject?
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and hello to all of you, and a big thank you to the two previous speakers, because they really have framed our discussion to show that there are actions we can take. You know, we are not simply at the mercy of huge structures, and that we can find solidarity that will allow us to make the university perhaps a better place to work, to create research, and to disseminate that knowledge. And I think that sometimes, especially for the emerging researchers, it can feel quite overwhelming, that you're kind of joining a very structured, metrified space. And I also am very aware that I'm probably preaching to the choir here, because you are all here because I think you feel some dissatisfaction with the way in which we currently make sense of what counts as valuable research, and how best can we make sure that the research that we produce is not only of high quality, but it actually has significant impact in the world. So I think it's already been mentioned that the Sorbonne in France, in Paris, announced, I think 2 weeks ago, that it was withdrawing from rankings, citing a lack of transparency in the methodology. And of course, it joins many others like Harvard and Yale's law and medical schools, Columbia, Utrecht. And in Africa and the whole continent, there's only one university that has not withdrawn from rankings, but actually refused to ever participate in rankings. And that is Rhodes University, where I work. And there definitely are significant consequences to that decision. And I'm going to end up by reflecting on some of those consequences. I want to start by thinking on a book by Edwin Slosson that many of you will be familiar with, called Great American Universities, where back in 1910, he tried to describe what it was that made some universities great. And in that mainly sort of narrative, descriptive text, it included a few diagrams and a bit of statistics. And he makes this statement. He says, in presenting these diagrams and statistics, I do not wish them to be given exaggerated importance. The really important things are incommensurable and uncountable. And I think that sadly, such cautions are largely gone. So despite DORA and the Barcelona Agreement, and as we've heard, the COARA and the Leiden Manifesto, where we hear that there's a large consensus about the problematic nature of some obscure, metrified notion of quality. Despite that, we continue to have this enormous multi-billion-dollar rankings industry. But it's important to note that of the big ranking industries, the big ranking companies, the oldest one is the Shanghai, and that was only started in 2003. So this entire thing of rankings, you know, we've always had a notion of status and some kind of hierarchy, problematic as that may be. But the rankings industry is really a very new industry. And I think that's important when people start to say, well, how else will the market know what counts as quality? And as I always say to my students, in a hyper-capitalist world, follow the money if you want to figure out what's going on. And I think a lot of people don't realize that the rankings industry doesn't make any money. The rankings are published for free. So how is it a multi-billion-dollar industry? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry because it uses the rankings to harvest data from our institutions, which it packages and sells. So it has one or two other ways of making money: advertising, big events, snazzy events that our VCs go to, and our university management, not mine, attend in fancy places. But the real money is from the data that we happily hand over for free. So I want to very quickly make a few points about why I find the rankings so problematic. As I say, I'm preaching to the choir. It's unscientific. Vice chancellors across South Africa that I've spoken to all agree it's unscientific, and yet they have them on their web pages. You just choose whichever ranking you look best in and you make sure that's the one. Why are they unscientific? Well, they use proxy measures that are distant from what they purport to measure. They use composite averaging, adding apples and pears and coming up with something that we wouldn't allow our undergraduate students to do. And of course, they're not transparent. You know, the arbitrary weighting would change the order if you change the weighting, but we're never very clear exactly what the weighting is. And, you know, point 4 of the Leiden Manifesto actually speaks about the idea that if you don't have transparent use of metrics, we shouldn't be using them. The whole idea of coercive isomorphism, that every university should be focused on research, and as was already mentioned, there is no focus on the idea of context, of history, and of local relevance. And point 2 of the Leiden Manifesto makes it very clear that you measure the value of an institution against its own identity, against what it has decided for itself it is trying to do. So locally relevant interventions are completely undermined by the rankings industry. Community engagement is not measured at all. Research is focused. What counts as research is basically English publications in another toxic industry, the academic publishing industry. And then so because they are not transparent, unscientific, and neo-colonial, we really need to put pressure on our institutions to say, come on, guys, if we are meant to be scientific organizations and we're living in an era of anti-intellectualism and science skepticism, and then we play these games that we know are absolutely unscientific, what does that say about our value system? And that goes back to this idea that if you don't know what your values are, you know, you'll fall for anything. So my final comment is about the implications of not being ranked. And that is that there is always an assumption that you're refusing to be ranked because you will perform badly. And that is why I'm so grateful that some of the big guns are choosing now to withdraw, because it makes it more possible for the rest of us. And I think it's really important to consider, why is the ranking industry so targeting Global South? And producing our own little patronizing rankings of emerging economies rankings and Global South rankings. It's because we're the market while the big guns are withdrawing. We need to be the new market. And so I think we need to be very skeptical about that. And then also the other implication is that if you refuse to give your data, they still rank you. They just use whatever publicly available data they can find on your institution. And so they just put naught for certain things where you refuse to hand over your data because you believe in privacy and you believe also in transparency. And you can hold those two things together. So that's my final word, just to say thank you to our colleagues for finding these spaces of solidarity. And we really need to say to our university leadership, we can't be scientific organizations that play unscientific games. Thank you. You're still muted, Suzanne.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Professor McKenna, and thank you. I can see that there's already some questions starting to populate in the chat box. So please, colleagues, let them come. We are monitoring the chat box as well. Thank you very much for that call for other institutions to join in solidarity to lend their support to further this particular course. Thank you, Prof. Professor Dyer, ready? Can I hand over to you for your thoughts?
Suzanne, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Great pleasure to be with you, and we've had some really excellent presentations already. Suzanne, you did have a specific question for me about the sector. What I would like to do, and it'll take me 5 to 7 minutes or so to do this, is to broaden the question somewhat by talking a bit about the Global South and research in the Global South. And then I'll certainly home in on what you've asked about, but also I would like to touch on some of what has emerged in the preceding talks, perhaps with specific reference again, if not to South Africa, then at least to the developing world. So to start off with, we talk about research in the Global North, Global South, and so on. Let me just mention one set of statistics which, in a sense, sets out or amplifies the huge distinctions that we have at play here. So if you go to UNESCO statistics on the number of researchers per million of population, for high-income countries, and these are very recent figures, for high-income countries, it's around 4,500. For South Africa, it's around 450. So it's 1/10. For Africa as a whole, it's 200, so it's less than a 20th. And for sub-Saharan Africa, it's half that. So that gives you an idea. It tells us that literally there are orders of magnitude of difference between research capacity in the Global South and in the Global North. And of course, over and above that, researchers in the Global South face multiple obstacles that are either absent in the Global North or much less of a threat. Access, real difficulties in access, the fact that open access cannot always be as open as one purports it to be. Poor resourcing. I don't think that any of the countries in Africa are spending close to the 1 to 1.5% target of expenditure on research as a proportion of GDP. And then perhaps most importantly is the disconnectedness, the fact that, let's talk about Africa in particular, African researchers to a large extent are disconnected from their global communities, their global research communities, if not actually invisible. So with that as the context, some of the questions, or a question that arises would be, what should be the priorities with regard to research assessment? What should be the prerequisites for effective research assessment in the Global South? Let's say, as part of broader transformation and strategies of growth and strengthening and so on of research. Firstly, and I have 3 of these. Firstly, what is important is a clarity of vision. What is the place, for example, of basic research in the research policies in the research environment in a country. What is the place of advancing knowledge? What is the place and what priorities are accorded to research aimed at addressing societal issues? Research that, or through which collaborative links are built. And this is so important because, once again, while we have reasonably good global North, global South collaborations, intra-African collaborations are very poor and in need of further strengthening. To what extent would that be perceived as a priority? What is the place of multidisciplinary work? The second would be really around what one would incentivize and reward. And here I'd like to refer to an article. It was actually a Nature commentary published in 2015 by Bruce Alberts and a number of colleagues, many of whom I think had been involved in setting up DORA about 2 years or so earlier. It's called Self-Correction in Science at Work, published in Nature. And the one point that they make is that, and of course, we've heard this in one way or another many times today, researchers need to be encouraged to publish well rather than often. So, Susan, you asked about the sector. Well, I can give an example of researchers being encouraged to publish often rather than well. And that would be the perverse incentives that flow from the research component of the state subsidy to universities. The basis for the subsidy allocated to universities is simply the number of publications. So there's a direct relationship between publication count and financial reward for the institution. This should not necessarily lead to perverse behavior, but it has done so because of the kinds of rewards that universities, ways in which universities reward researchers. You have behaviors such as what's called salami slicing or least publishable units, a reluctance to collaborate with those outside the institution because only a proportion of your work will generate income. This hugely undermines the strength and impact of the research environment in the country. I'm not blaming the ministry, I'm blaming our universities and the leadership of our universities, who ought to be able to guide our researchers or their researchers and encourage them to publish well rather than often. And by the way, I think that ASAF has an important role to play in engaging with the universities around what is, in a sense, a policy for science issue. The second point I want to make is a question. Who exactly is going to do the assessment in this context of a continent where we do not have critical mass? Who's going to sit on hiring and promotion committees, reviewing grant applications, and so on? It is vital, therefore, while we build a critical mass of scientists or researchers, more broadly speaking, that we also build a critical mass of reviewers. We develop reviewing skills, particularly amongst our younger researchers, bring them on board, get them to do reviewing at an early stage, and reward and recognize reviewing work as well. Finally, I'd just like to touch on the matter of assessments, and this applies perhaps more generally than just the Global South. And I'll be very quick with some of these because we've heard quite extensively from some of our earlier speakers, certainly about avoiding the inappropriate use of metrics. I do believe that metrics have a place if used carefully and appropriately and as an adjunct, and not in any way as a decisive measure. We have to understand the various differences, for example, amongst disciplines and the like. Secondly, we heard earlier, I think, in the it might have been in Sue's talk around, no, the earlier talk around, and in fact in Ludo's talk as well, around narrative CVs. In fact, we had some really good examples of narrative CVs. I'll say no more about it, except to mention that this was also a point that Albert's and co-authors had highlighted. Then what has not come up here is the, I don't think anyway, is the strategy or the approach of asking reviewers to evaluate select pieces of work. Bearing in mind that you will have a number of reviewers, ask each of them to evaluate, perhaps the 3 articles that the researcher regards as their best. And furthermore, and this is something that I experienced as a review for somebody who was up for tenure at a major research university in the US, I was asked to do something like that, but I was also asked to make a comparative assessment, of the work of this particular individual against that of another individual who had already had tenure in a different institution working in the same area. So, and there are perhaps variations on this sort of theme. And then finally, I think it's really important to build into the process impact, measuring impact. It should be very much part of the process with clear guidelines as well. And here I would refer, for example, to TARA, the Tools to Advance Research Assessment that has been developed by DORA. It's a simple 2-dimensional arrangement of scale of influence on the one hand against new audiences, and picks up on factors such as relevance, utility, credibility, and so on. But perhaps I should stop there. Thanks very much, Susan.
Thank you, Professor Reddy, and thank you very much for offering some advice as well as to what we could do in going forward. But thank you also for raising the question of then what is the role of ASIP? Very particularly because we're asking ourselves as well, what is the role of ASIP in research, reform, assessments, etc. You specifically know very well of our mandate, and I'm sure that our counterparts in the Netherlands, as an Academy of Sciences, what are our roles? So that would be interesting to probe that as well. You asked some very pertinent, some very critical questions. I hope we have time to unpack them a little bit more. Thank you for your contribution. Then Dr. Jensi Flores-Bioso, over to you, ma'am. Your 10 minutes coming up.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me here. I just want to make sure that you can see my screen, please.
Can you put it on full presentation mode?
Is it on full right now?
No, it's not on full.
Okay. Okay, 1 second.
You can do that again at what you did and then just click swap displays.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Wonderful. Is that okay? Is that better?
We still cannot see it, Jensi.
Okay. 1 second. I will share now my screen. Apologies for this. I think I will be able to do this now. And then okay. Now can you see it?
Perfect. Thank you very much. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. And sorry about that. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and talk about a research study that I have contributed to. And a little bit about me. I'm a computational protein designer. I work in synthetic biology, and I was lucky enough to have a Marie Curie to allow me to train in the laboratory of Professor David Baker, who was awarded last year's Nobel Prize for the development of this program, who designs new proteins for different aspects for developing vaccines, carbon storage, and other drugs, for example. However, this is not a simple career for me. I am originally from Honduras. For those of you who doesn't know, it's this small country in Central America, which actually gave me a lot of advantages because the research wasn't there yet. So I had to learn a lot of things if I wanted to be a researcher. So for example, I learned to be autodidactic, resourceful, creative, and persistence. But also it gave me a lot of disadvantages being from Honduras. There was no accredited training in molecular biology there, or master's or PhD programs, or no local funding for any PhD program, for example, or scholarship or research support offices. So if I wanted to write a grant, I had to, or a scholarship application, I had to do it on my own without any support that I see that other universities now offer. So how do I get here? So it took a lot of determination, like applying and improving myself for over 7 years, of rejections, and a contextualized funding program developed by the European Commission in an Erasmus program for Central American countries, or the poorest countries in the Latin American region, and a qualitative assessment via an interview given by my professor and the head of the master's degree, who actually decided to interview me because I didn't fulfill the minimum criteria to be accepted in this training program. You see, in Honduras, there were no credits for molecular biology or biochemistry, but I had self-learned all these topics, and I could show her the books that I used to read and study on my own. So in that way, I got there. And because of this experience, I became very much aware of this problem. And I started to work on it through my engagement in the Global Young Academy, the Young Academy of Ireland, and with that, the other organizations that were opened for me. I was part of the steering board of the Quara as well, and I work on other scientific groups to develop and advance open science. So, but today I'm going to focus my work mostly in the global study that I had the honor to co-lead with from 29 researchers from 21 countries in the globe, including several African countries. And we decided to study how researchers are evaluated worldwide, using a cross-sectional analysis to examine the assessment criteria used in promotion policies that are focused for full professor and in the widely adopted tracks, applicable only for academic institutions. In this way, we collected 532 policies from 190 academic institutions, 58 governmental agencies in 121 countries, 32 from the global north and 89 from the global south. So we found 30 prevalent criteria that can be grouped in 5 categories: career development, recognition, teaching and services, general traits, and research outputs, with research outputs being the most prevalent criteria or category in all the work that we found, in all the policies, sorry. So to assess research outputs, we found 11 prevalent criteria, 7 quantitative and 5 qualitative. And as you can see in this chart, all policies, no matter if they were institutional or national, relied heavily on quantitative indicators. However, we did find that institutional policies from the global north were using a bit more qualitative criteria. We're starting to adopt more qualitative criteria compared to other regions in the world. So we analyze, we wanted to study the co-occurrence of these evaluation criteria. So because we found that similar criteria tend to cluster together within the same documents. This means that most policies showed a narrow focus with less emphasis in diversity of the profiles of candidates, or less emphasis on different team roles, which was discussed earlier in this talk. Well, in a previous talk, sorry. So what does it mean? It means that some institutions focus their evaluation on output metrics, for example, which is number of publications, number of authors, and journal index. While other like output and impact, like patents, funding, and journal impact. Others prefer professional development, like accumulated citations, experience abroad, and service to the profession. While others were preferably looking for visibility and engagement, like social impact, community engagement, qualitative aspects of research outputs. In addition, we wanted to see what were the factors that influenced the choice of criteria in each policy. And for this, we developed this regression analysis to analyze each of the context-related and job-related items that we could capture in these policies. These include region and the policy scope, whether it was institutional or governmental, or the income level of the country, the continent, and the job-related ones, which are like track, if the policy was for full academic professor, or which discipline was the policy from. And we found that job characteristics such as disciplines, career tracks, and rank were not significantly determinant of the criteria assessed. That means that, for example, we only found that research track, the track of research and engineering among the disciplines had some differences to prefer, for example, in research, higher level of visibility, or, for example, higher level of less career development and more outcomes and impact. On the other hand, we found that contextual social characteristics such as region, policy scope, and income level and continent had a greater effect in determining the criteria for evaluation. So in this regard, we found that compared to Europe, for example, institutions in the global south were preferred more like output metrics, were more focused on output metrics. And this was specifically true for countries that have upper middle income countries, policies that are from upper middle countries. On the other hand, for example, among continents, Latin America was the continent that least focused on output metrics. The same we found for visibility and engagement. For example, at country level, income level, for example, Europe was more prevalent on visibility and engagement than other countries, or higher income countries were more looking for visibility engagement than lower income countries. And for example, we find that career development was more sought in the global south, for example. And outcomes and impact were less sought in lower income countries, which is kind of an opposite or very contradicting, because these countries should be focusing more, like, for example, on the impact of research and the outcomes of research, so that they can translate to innovation. Now, this was also supported by work done from the GYA, a colleague from mine, Carlo Di Politi, but this was work done through the GYA and the the International Science Council and the Inter-Academy Partnership. And this was presented And in this case, it was presented and they found the same, that journal level metrics and publication level metrics were most popular among the organizations that were included. This work was done by a consulting company, Culture Base, and was presented by Ben Blisley. Sorry. Okay, so what are the main takeaways of this work? So we found that research promotion criteria are not uniform. They vary across institutions and countries. Each policy shows a preferred cluster of criteria, which highlights the lack of diversity in quality sought per institution or agency. And the pronounced difference were not in job-related factors, but by the context where the researcher was evaluated. Importantly, we found that scientometrics are more popular in upper middle income countries. So one way to change this or to promote some change, we think is through young academies. Because in the study that was presented earlier, they showed that young academies were leapfrogging from traditional approaches of research evaluation. And this was, this was noticeable in the Zimbabwe Young Academy of Science, the Young Academy of Netherlands, and the Young Academy of Spain. So how can we make it better for ECRs worldwide, science and society? I say measure ability rather than opportunity, welcome diversity of career paths. Metrics do not provide context, so there shouldn't be valid indicators. And incentive systems drive culture. So let's be aware that what is measured will ultimately be valued and prioritized. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jensie Flores-Beer. So again, very fascinating to see actually what is happening globally. And the comparison that you tried to draw between the different countries, etc. Yes, and we're not, I think, surprised that it's not uniform. And I think that's part of a major problem. And then, of course, the lack of diversity, which the reformation of research assessments, that's the main thing, and multilingualism that you would like to actually address. And then very interesting, then the context where the researcher actually finds himself, that plays a huge influence in the evaluation as such. So thank you very much for those thoughts that you have shared. I would like to ask our two previous speakers, Professor Waltman and Dr. Swirbons, would you just like to comment or perhaps ask our three speakers that have spoken now, perhaps a question or two?
Shall I kick off, Ludo?
Yes, please do.
So, I mean, just first reflection on, I guess, a kind of a thread across the three presentations. I think one thing that some of these rankings and focus on metrics and the publication system contributes to that as well, or the publishing industry, I should say, is that we are getting more and more convergence. There's really this kind of effort to try and create this one-size-fits-all mold, ideally a number that's easily digestible and gives us easy answers to very complex questions. And I just want to add that for me, part of what's at the core of COARA is to go away from that convergence and create more divergence again and allow institutions, but also individuals to shape their mission and vision and then be assessed against whether they're achieving that. And I think that kind of touches on some of the points made across all of the presentation, especially I think the first one on, what is this influence of the ranking over the system? I do think this convergence is a big part of it and a big part of the problem. But also in the presentation of Daya, there was reference to, including impact. And I think we need to be careful and think really about, for each evaluation, what's the purpose and who are we, what is the subject of the evaluation? And we need to promote tools like the scope framework that Ludo talked about to ensure that we're really assessing appropriately and proportionately. And I think that's, for me, a really big takeaway across the 3 presentations. Then one thing that I am sometimes struggling with, especially when we look at kind of projects that summarize all the things that we now use to assess, especially researchers, is that we don't really use any competency-based evaluation. So whether people have the right skills to do the job, because of course, especially when you're hired by a university, you become professors, there's other things than research that you'll need to do. You'll need to manage finances, you'll need to manage a team. Increasingly, the teams are increasing, they're often becoming more complex. So maybe just also a question for Jensi and maybe others if they have reflections is, and sorry, also in the context of, in the UK, part of assessment reform, one of the goals of the government with it is also to increase porosity between academia and other sectors. But I think there is this tension that intrinsically academia is rewarding productivity, whereas other sectors are really rewarding competency. And there's this disconnect that I don't see we can immediately overcome. So I did want to ask Jensi whether in any of the research there's anything related to competency alongside all the other dimensions that you've talked about.
Thank you very much for your reflections. Professor Waldman, would you like to reflect also on some issues?
Yes, I'm pleased to do so. I think this is an extremely rich conversation, and there's an endless number of topics that are on the table here. But let me just try to highlight a few things that I feel really deserve further consideration. And I definitely don't pretend I have all the answers, but at least I feel these issues need more of our, let's say, collective thinking. So what was also part of the discussion is, of course, the funding system that you have in South Africa, and you're not the only country with such a system where indeed funding is directly tied to publishing. And then, of course, what you often see is this kind of trickling down of these incentives within organizations. And what was also raised is the point, like, if indeed we move towards more qualitative ways of doing evaluation and we rely more on peer review, then who actually are the peers? So who is actually entitled, but also who's willing to take on that role of being an expert evaluator? So I think in this area, we are facing some really big questions. So I feel that assessment reform is going to be extremely difficult in a setting where you have kind of certain external mechanisms that are pushing back so strongly that certain kind of aspirations of the assessment reform movement seem to be kind of impossible to realize. So if you indeed have for instance, funding mechanisms that put so much emphasis on output, on publishing, then I think we can keep talking endlessly about getting rid of impact factors and all of that. But yeah, in the end, the money, of course, does play a role in kind of how we all behave. So it seems to me that the funding needs to be part of the conversation, and if you want to make progress here. The other thing, who can be part of evaluations? Who could be actually the peers that perform the peer review? I think there's perhaps two things there. One is that we need to ask ourselves more often, why do we actually evaluate? And is it really needed in all these situations to do the evaluation? The peers, well, those who are being invited often to be a peer, they complain endlessly about being overburdened, being asked too much. And that, I guess, means that if we want to rely more on expert judgment, peer review, we need to critically ask ourselves, when is it really needed and when could we perhaps do without? But also, should we perhaps indeed bring in people that normally are not being invited to participate in this evaluation process? Could be indeed younger academics, could also be perhaps, let's say, societal stakeholder citizens in certain cases. And I think in particular the idea of bringing in younger academics that was mentioned is interesting. what we found in a study that we did at my center is with the narrative CVs, we found a bit of a depressing result. The narrative CVs don't really work if, in the end, the interpretation of the CV is done by established academics that, well, already have their established ideas on how you do evaluation. They will kind of just ignore the narrative and do the traditional thing. If you bring in, however, younger academics who are still kind of open to new ways of doing things, then suddenly it seems things are changing. So there seems to be a strong case there for actually opening that debate about who should be entitled to be part of the conversation about the conversation that we perform when we carry out evaluation, qualitative evaluation. So this is, I think, one part of the whole puzzle. One other final thing I want to mention is we are talking all the time about publishing, and I think in the publishing system, there's of course lots we can complain about the system, and some of you already said, like, well, it's a system that is deeply flawed and all of that, and I agree. But then the question also is, if we want to change the assessment system, what does it actually entail for the publishing system? And my point is that I think we cannot change the assessment system if we don't also change the publishing system. It's, I think, impossible. So the publishing system needs to become fully integrated in the conversations that we are having about assessment reform. And I think we should also, the aspirations that we have for how we want evaluation to develop, these same aspirations should also apply to how we publish. So if we want openness, if we want context dependence, if we want qualitative judgment to prevail over numbers, all these things should also apply in how we do publishing. And that means a publishing system that's very different from what we have at the moment. So that's just a few reflections and comments.
Thank you, Prof. I think what you have done now is to really knock that nail on its head, because I think that was one of my concerns so far, because one of my questions would have been, is where do we start? But you are absolutely right. There are so many pressures from the outside towards the system, which would not make it very easy for us to actually change and to affect all these different lenses that have already been identified during this afternoon's discussion. But still, I'm a forever optimist and I'm forever positive. And being an open science advocatist myself, I cannot believe that no is the answer. I do believe that even the little things that we do eventually and over time would bring some change. And I think that for me is very important. Colleagues, we are actually coming to the end of this webinar of today. We have not really touched upon any of the questions, but I think those in the chat box for me was really significant and an indicator of the problems we are facing in the system as a whole. So it was not meant to resolve them, but I think that they are very important in showing us which are the things that we have to consider. I think from ASAP's point of view, we will certainly make some notes of this particular meeting so that we can, again, with the help of KNIW, perhaps see, well, what else can we do? And I think the different lenses and perspectives was very interesting to this discussion. I am going to give our speakers really half a minute, perhaps just to conclude before I hand over to our Executive Officer, Professor Sudyal. Thank you, Jensi, and then perhaps Professor Reddy, Karen, Sue McKenna, and then Professor Waldman. Really just a half a minute, and that's sort of the sequence. Thank you so much. Jensi, if you can start.
Well, I just wanted to again touch on young researchers, being the drivers of the change. And I think that if you support, and I have seen that many young academies have a been established in Africa, for example, if you support them, they could be driving and helping in the drive of this work. So I will encourage senior academies or anyone working in this to work with young academies in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Reddy?
Suzanne, yeah, thanks. Just two very quick points. Firstly, going back to what Ludo was saying a moment ago, yeah, I think there we have some real challenges if we are going to, in a very serious way, approach these alternative approaches to assessment and like. The chief one being, you know, what we sometimes refer to as reviewer fatigue. First of all, probably not enough reviewers, not enough individuals. And then secondly, probably a reluctance on the part of some reviewers, potential reviewers, to agree to do so, particularly if they are asked, you know, for example, to do a serious critique evaluation of a number of papers by someone. So we have to be aware of that, and we really have to work towards, I think, achieving these goals nationally rather than this or that university. And so my final point is I come back to the role of ASAF as the National Academy of South Africa and the role that ASAF could and I think should play in convening, bringing the universities together. We don't need more surveys. We don't need more reports. We've got some excellent stuff out there, as we've heard today. We need some real serious thinking about how we move in the direction of more effective forms of assessment that take us away from these metric-dominated procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
I think I
Dr.
was, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I agree with a lot of what has been said. And I think this is often the problem. We probably need to go out there and try to invade disciplinary conferences where we're not speaking to those already engaged. But I just want to agree with Daya that I think reflection is a key word here. I think we need to really reflect on when we need to evaluate and what we need to evaluate and for what reason. Who is involved, and I think Yancy makes a good point on involving young researchers, but I would also really argue, depending on the purpose, it could also be valuable to include beneficiaries of research, but also other professionals at universities like research managers and HR professionals. And then, yeah, I think there's really hopefully also an openness to change that doesn't just consider metrics and peer review. I think there's other methods that have been underused in academia, but that have been used in other sectors that we should also look at. So I think there's really scope to do things differently. And I think a growing willingness. So we hopefully can make use of that momentum. And as a last message, for those who are interested, please look at the website of COARA. We are really encouraging organizations also from the African continent and from anywhere in the world to join us. Our national chapters are already showing that they can really help bring stakeholders together to then overcome legal and policy barriers at national levels. And I have heard here today that that's also a problem on the African continent. So please do engage with us, because we are really keen to engage more members on the African continent. And we, of course, continue to welcome all the organizations in the Netherlands that are already working closely with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Professor McKenna.
Yes, just two very quick last points. And the one is around values. I think we just need to pause before we get busy with how things are always done and assume that that's always going to be the way. And so in terms of values, why are we publishing? What are we publishing? What is research for? Why are we evaluating? Let's go back to basics and ask those fundamental questions. You know, that cliche, if you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything. And I do think that that's really important. And then secondly, just to echo this idea of solidarity, that there are lots of people doing really good work in this regard. And we've got ASAF, we've got COARA, we've got, this Leiden Manifesto we can draw on. So let's work together more. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. So once again, thank you to the speakers of this particular session. It has been absolutely fascinating. Professor Sudyal, over to you to conclude. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you to all the speakers. I echo what Susan said in terms of the value that has come through the dialogue and the narratives that you've presented, and to members of the audience who's been populating the chat box and the responses we've been getting all around. I have a much more esteemed colleague, Professor Stephanie Burton, who I saw on the chat, and I've dropped her a note to say I think she should add some closing statements. Professor Burton served on the ASAP Council, is an esteemed academic, and served in the position of DVC Research at the University of Pretoria, and currently holds the seat of co-chair of the Inter-Academy Partnership. And I think it's just fitting to have her share a few reflections on the webinar and to have her say the final words. So bye from me, and thank you all for participating. I'll take advantage of my camera stabilizing for now and switch off, and over to you, Professor Burton, for some closing remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for what I must tell you is an impromptu opportunity, but I'm very pleased to have it. First of all, let me say thank you to everybody for the wisdom that they've shared today, and the deep thought that has gone into all of the discussion. My job is really just to reflect kind of on the behalf of ASAF, and of course ASAF stands partly for recognition of excellence and recognition of academic achievement and so on. But when I think about that, I think there's a very broad role that can be played, and I would like to just mention that there is a report which was done, it was an initiative between the IAP, the Inter-Academies Partnership, the Global Young Academy, and the International Science Council, which was published in 2022, which I realize is a couple of years ago, but it was an initiative on research evaluation. And I think that's one of the good places to start considering what the international position is. But let me just turn, Himla asked me to make some comments about the South African perspective, and it's a little perhaps apt that today the Times Higher Education World University Rankings were published, the new ones. And I can tell you from my own experience that right now, every Deputy Vice Chancellor in the country is taking a look at those and doing some heart searching about where they have improved or not. But the point I want to make about that is that actually those rankings are really very difficult to decipher, if you like. They deal with things like internationalization and research environment and sustainability. What they don't deal with very clearly, as what Daya raised, which is impact. And how do we measure impact? This is one set of rankings. There are others that are better at it. But the issue of impact is very relevant to the Southern Hemisphere, to the Global South, and to our own region. In terms of the fact that we look at what we're doing in terms of academia, and we try to look at how we assess the research that we're doing. But what none of those metrics and rankings really approach is our national strategy and our institutional strategies, which take into account, for example, societal relevance and the impact of engaged research and citizen science. And how do we align what we're looking at in terms of research assessment with national and regional imperatives around, for example, the societal benefit of the research that we do? We don't actually match those up very often when we have this kind of discussion about research assessment. And in South Africa, though, and in the region of or Southern Africa, Global South, that issue of the importance of the research that we do and the relevance of it is a critical issue. I think the other one that we need perhaps to consider, and again, it is something where it needs to be fairly open, is the fact that why we use these kind of assessments and evaluation of research and so on, including things like leadership, is often to measure on an individual basis, and I'm saying it carefully, but on an individual basis, achievement with respect to leadership and with respect to service to society and service to the community, what you put sometimes under the umbrella of academic citizenship. But we use these kind of measures to try to match achievement of these performance indicators, if you like, with the research that's being done. And my view is that we are a long way from really having a clear way of doing that. Even worse, as has been mentioned in the chat and by a couple of the speakers, sometimes this kind of assessment of research and evaluation of impact and so on actually leads to incentives. They personal or financial incentives, which is very, very thin ice, because we simply don't have probably the kind of data and the range of ways to assess that will allow us to make that fair. Finally, I just want to add one point that was made very briefly, and that is that there are very wide-ranging, complicated, ambiguous effects on behavior that come from using some metrics or a lot of metrics. What we haven't mentioned today is the added complexity that's coming, and it is coming, when we start to rely more clearly and transparently on artificial intelligences to help us to measure whatever it is we are trying to put together into the package of research evaluation. So my final comment really is simply to say we have a wealth of information, an overload of information and data, as has been said, but I think we are quite a long way from developing the wisdom that will allow us to make our research evaluation completely fair. And I hope that ASAF can make a useful contribution as we go forward in trying to bring that together and to use our own academy and our relationship with other academies to bring to this that more nuanced approach. I don't have all the answers, but I certainly can see all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Burton. Thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to all of you who have stayed with us for the past 2 hours in listening and contributing in whichever way you have. And I also want to take this opportunity of thanking my ASAP colleagues, Tozama, Henriette, and Raj, and others who have been working behind the scenes to allow us to host this webinar in partnership with the Netherlands Academy of Science. Thank you all and have a good and awesome day forward. Lovely seeing you all. Take care now. Bye.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks. Bye all.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Yeah,